Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a great joy and a profound sense of responsibility that I opened the Salon Historique, the inaugural event of the International Conference, Slavery, Resistance and Democracy, exploring Swiss-Brazilian connections in the 19th century Atlantic world here at the University of Lausanne. Thank you. Thank you all, invited scholars, colleagues, students, institutional partners for being here today. Many of you have traveled far and wide to be here from Brazil and the United States, from across Europe and Switzerland itself. Especially thanks to our interpreter, Vanessa Ikemori, who will guide us through the Portuguese version of the Salon Historique. This evening marks the beginning of a collective and collaborative journey. This journey stems from a research project led by Professor Bernhard Schär and supported by the Swiss National Science Foundation. The project involves scholars in Brazil, India, Lesotho, and beyond. But this moment is necessary for more than that. It provides space for researchers specialized in Brazil and Switzerland, two nations that were shaped during the 19th century, to come together and engage. Early to or mid-1800, Brazil was becoming an independent empire, one that was still built on enslaved labor. Meanwhile, Switzerland was establishing a new federal democracy, though it remained under the influence of a conservative and aristocratic elite. Despite their differences, both countries looked to the Atlantic as a space of opportunity. It is in this Atlantic world that their stories intersect, although for a long time they were rarely examined together. This conference begins with an uncomfortable and vital truth. Switzerland, often perceived as neutral and isolated, was in fact deeply embedded in the process of imperial globalization in the 19th century. Switzerland had no formal colonies, however, Swiss individuals played direct and indirect roles in slavery, plantation economy, and Brazil modernization as colonies, plantation owners, investors, mercenaries, missionaries, and merchants. These ties go back even further. By the 17th century, Swiss merchants were already in Lisbon and other Portuguese ports. After 1808, when the Portuguese court relocated to Brazil, these transatlantic connections intensified. At the same time, conservative Brazilian elites looked to Switzerland, welcoming its colonists, scientists, ideas, and institutional models. In 1819, the King Don João VI granted permission for Nova Friburgo to be established, the first officially recognized non-Portuguese colony in Brazil. Later, Felisberto Caldeira Brandt, the Marquese of Barbacena, a key figure in Brazil's independence, sent his two sons to study at the Fellenberg Agricultural School in Hofwil, near Bern. For a time, Dom Pedro II, Dom Pedro II, was also expected to study there, although this never materialized. However, he did become an admirer of Louis Agassiz, supporting his travels and research in Brazil. These connections were significant. They were central to the circulation of wealth, knowledge, and power across the 19th century Atlantic world. Yet, for much of the 20th century, these histories were rarely studied together. Brazilian and Swiss historiographies followed separated paths. This is precisely why this Salon Historique and this conference matters. It's not just a scholarly gathering, it's a space for dialogue and respectful, generous exchange. It's a space for critical reflection and listening across borders. This afternoon, the Salon Historique, we will begin by looking back through the eyes of four distinguished scholars, Béatrice Ziegler, Rafael de Bivar Marquese, Marianne Mahony, and Maria Helena Machado. You're seated exactly in the order I wrote. Over the next 3 days, we will hear many such stories. Some will be told in parallel, others together. Many will speak of silences, of what was erased, ignored, or conveniently forgotten. This conference cannot cover everything. However, I hope that we'll initiate a more open, collaborative, and historically grounded conversation that does not shy away from the inequalities that have shaped and still shape our shared past. With that, it's with my great pleasure to hand the floor to the Professor Bernhard, who will introduce today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Izabel. Warm welcome from me also. It's really great seeing all of you here today. I mean, as you can imagine, mainly Izabel. I mean, to be honest, mainly Izabel, but me too, a little bit. We have been talking a lot about this conference and organizing. So yeah, it's absolutely fantastic to see that this is actually now happening. So after this brilliant introduction, I think then a question, it seems to me, naturally arises. I mean, Izabel, she was telling us how old and significant and kind of astonishing also these historical connections are between this space here in Switzerland and Brazil, going back to the 17th century. And so this is really remarkable. So what you showed us, this is a world that is kind of not a different world that we live in today. This is a world that still comes from the early modern period where we didn't have these strong nation states and national governments. So these people were, many of them, of course, enforced. If we think of enslaved people, others looking for opportunities, were very mobile, actually, across the transatlantic world. So it seems a little bit of a paradox then. We here as historians working on both sides of the Atlantic, trying to make sense of this. It took a long time for us to meet, I would say. Too long, maybe. So yeah, I mean, the question, maybe the provocative question at the beginning to kick off this Salon Historique, and I think Salon Historique is also quite fitting because we're speaking of this world. The Salon, of course, as those of you who are proficient in European history, the Salon is, of course, also an early modern kind of institution, and very importantly so, it was mainly educated women who organized these salons for exchanges. So this is the time before we had these big modern universities, which very much shaped our own thinking. So I think having this format of a salon, then the question is, so the first question we like to pose to all of you is, working in different kind of regions in this Atlantic world, from your experience, why did it take so long? And I'd like to start with you, Beatrice. Why did it take so long for us to gather here like this? Because if I remember correctly, it's been 40 years since your book came out. 40 years in 1985, right? The first book speaking about Swiss migrants who ended up as small croppers, I think is the word, on Brazilian plantations. Yeah. Why did it take so long?
I'm very pleased to be here, and I will try to give an answer, but it's quite difficult for me because it's true. I made research which was published in '85, but then I left the topic and didn't follow really these histories. So I can't really answer this question, why it took so long, but I can tell something about which was the situation in '85, in the late 70s and in the beginning of the 80s in Switzerland, and perhaps too a little bit in Brazil. In Switzerland, there was a small window which was going to be opened in the late 70s for overseas studies, but it closed very soon again, because the politics and the society didn't follow this and didn't want to have to study such topics anymore. It closed again to Swiss politics and perhaps in Europe, but not in overseas. This was an important thing because then there was no money left for researchers who wanted to look overseas. This for Switzerland. When I went to Brazil, the political situation was quite another one. There was the end of the dictatorship, and history was in a very difficult situation. I couldn't tell it and study it very well, but I realized in many respects, for example, the libraries and the archives were in a poor state, and historians had a very hard time, as many others too. So there was no time for really deeper research in these topics, as in others too.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. We decided we're just going to give very, very short introductions of our esteemed guests because you're going to talk more about your biography later on. So let me just, I forgot to mention that this Beatrice Ziegler, of course, Professor Emeritus from the University of Zurich and this Swiss technical school from northwestern Switzerland, and that's also just to be very transparent. Beatrice is also my former boss, one of the first professors to take me on as a young nobody and give me a chance, so we have history together, but very good history, I should say. I'd like to pose you the same question to you, Rafael. Rafael, of course, you, professor at the University of Sao Paulo, and have done a lot of work on administration and management, but also science and plantations. And I've been reading some of your work, so Rafael is now at the moment comparing Brazil with all different kinds of regions across the globe. It seems very kind of inspiring work for the long-term project, which we're all looking forward for your global history of coffee and slavery that I think is in the making. So, but to take a step back, Rafael, and of course in your framework, I mean, if we read your work, you point many times at the significance of this space, not only Switzerland, but this larger region in Europe. Why didn't we meet earlier?
So, tough question, Bernhard. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a wonderful conference, Izabel, as well. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I think Izabel gave part of the answer when she was talking about, let's say, the historiographical specializations that we have in our field. So that's the way how we do history. We do history being, let's say, really focused on a given field. And when we come to, let's say, to these topics, I think we are paying the price for specialization. And in the sense that, you see, in Brazil, we pay attention to Swiss input. When we come to 19th century, migration, so every time we talk about Nova Friburgo and the parceria system. But you see, really on these direct, straight connections between events in different places. Without, let's say, a broader perspective on how to connect processes that seemingly apart, but processes that belong to a common history. And it's a quite challenging endeavor to, let's say, to build these bridges between different historiographical boxes, let's put this way. And I see at least, let's say, I'm not going to say any novelty, but from, let's say, the turn to the 21st century with all the global perspectives and the call for these broader views of historical processes, then we can have some ground to, let's say, to put in conversation different historiographical traditions, perspectives. And it's quite challenging as well, because usually what we do when we face this kind of challenge, just to come back to older perspectives, trying to, let's say, establish direct connections. But and this is the best way to do this kind of research. But I think what's really challenging is how to build, let's say, another framework in order to put these different historiographical traditions in conversation. This is one question, one problem, and the other one, it's basic. I think it's a question of funding. So funding, yeah. And so how it was possible to, let's say, to arrange this conference with funding? That's a, let's say, really materialistic view of the process, no? And it's really hard because nowadays we are facing everywhere. It's not only a thing that's going in Brazil, but going in US and going, I think, as well in Europe. Funding cuts everywhere for the humanities. So, but on the other hand, we have also something that allows us to build this kind of new conversation. All these possibilities that technologies give us to produce this kind of conversation. So I was talking to André this morning, and he was telling me, so he's part of this research for a long time, but it's first, and you have a lot of meetings online, and you were able to do the research through this online meetings. So there's also other possibilities, chances to build upon, more or less like that.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, frameworks, funding, thank you all for the spot. We'd like to thank the Swiss National Science Foundation, who, by the way, is also facing a terrible cut of, I think, 11% of the budget. So yeah, that just also shows how important these institutions are. Marianne Mahony, you came to us from the Central Connecticut State University, and that is where you also are director of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies Center, sorry. And of course, yeah, I mean, extremely important, groundbreaking work on the history of slavery in the cacao-producing region of Bahia, which is of particular significance for us in this research group. I mean, several members, and next to Izabel, of course, Michael Schmitz, who is here, and others who are in this room. So, yeah, again, thank you very much for coming. Yeah. From your US, I would say, I mean, you were educated in the US and you're also kind of affiliated in the US. What's your US take of why didn't we meet earlier?
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Izabel. Thank you, Bernhard, for those kind words and the invitation. So, yes, I think I'll try to give a little bit of an American perspective, but here on this mesa with everyone who has worked in Sao Paulo, I will represent o nordestino também, the Northeast. So I think for historiography, to start there in the United States, especially at the time, U.S. imperialism, British imperialism, Spanish and Portuguese imperialism were, and the way that they functioned in Latin America were central questions. And there was much less focus on Switzerland, and also given that part of Switzerland is in German, and German is not frequently taught anymore in the United States, and French has lost space to Spanish, right? And there is a growing Spanish and Portuguese-speaking population in the United States. I mean, that is kind of driving much of, or many of the questions in the historiography in the US. In terms of slavery studies, there was always this comparative element of, right, these two continental-sized nations that were among the last to abolish slavery in the Americas. And so there's a lot of work comparing those two things. But if the infrastructure was difficult in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, in Bahia, it was almost non-existent. There was no PhD program
anywhere. WESC was the Federação de Escolas Superiores Ilhéus Itabuna, which translates to the Federation of Professional Schools in Ilhéus and Itabuna, and it was essentially an agronomy school, a law school, and a plantation management school. There were no historians, and historical inquiry was not welcome because there were uncomfortable things being found having to do with indigenous history, the history of slavery, and it was not the past at that time there. Abolition had happened many, many years before, but the same families were still there with land, with power, with property, and it is not until Vassoura de Bruxa, the witch's broom disease, attacked the cacao plantations and the economy fell apart that it became easy to explore some of the questions that we're working on. I would also say that technology and funding, the expansion of universities to the northeast of Brazil has made so much difference, that it's almost another world from an intellectual perspective. Yeah, so I guess, yeah? Não sei o que vocês acham.
Well, thanks. I mean, thanks for this. Is just kind of like the input. We're just getting started. We're getting warmed up. So I think, last but not least, in this first round, Maria Helena, also of course professor for history at the University of Sao Paulo. A very important work on slavery, abolition, crime, and resistance. Women and gender, which is of particular relevance also to our project. I think this is why and how we got in touch. Maternity, of course, an important topic, and as we will hear more tomorrow, also science, and of course, Louis Agassiz, one of your characters, and we're very much looking forward to the keynote and tomorrow. So, and I would also mention, I saw that you also had a collaboration with an artist who might be known around here, Sascha Huber, who is this Swiss, Caribbean, Finnish artist who works also in Louis Agassiz. So, yeah, very prolific kind of output in scholarly terms, but also, I mean, you curated also exhibitions, etc. and so forth. That's just to kind of give a context for people who might not know you yet. Yeah, Maria Helena, then to you also then, just to round off to finish this first round. Why didn't we meet before?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Bernhard, Izabel, good friend Everett, and everybody, the colleagues. Well, I arrived to Swiss questions by chance, completely, late in my career, because I work with social history of slavery. But in 2003-04, I was at Harvard University as Brazilian fellow at David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. And I am a curious person. So going here and there, I finish up at Hutton Archive, which are the archives from Harvard professor. And I found out that William James, the philosopher of pragmatism, was in Brazil. And I found his diaries, letters, drawings, and I was fascinated. But I discovered that he was in an expedition with Louis Agassiz, which, of course, I knew by reading Travels in Brazil, but I didn't know anything else. I was not interested. Then I started to research at Museum of Comparative Zoology, at Peabody Museum, which is the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnology, and has the huge amount of images, photographs. And I started to dig up a history that amazed me and shocked me because Louis Agassiz was the biggest racist in the US. He was one of the persons who stimulated the segregation. And I discovered that he had many ties with Brazil. He corresponded with Emperor Pedro II. He was just divulgating the richness of Brazil and stimulating the ex-confederates to migrate to Brazil, to settle there. And he was working to the opening of Amazon River to U.S. interests. He was connected by slavery branch in the South. So I started to dig up so many stuff. And because William James is very well known, everybody likes him. He used to be a wonderful person. The publisher of David Rockefeller Center came interested in publishing the letters, etc., all the material. But I wrote something about William James in the Agassiz expedition. And by chance, Harvard University Press was interested, not the David Rockefeller Center publisher. So came out a beautiful book. Later on, in 2006, the book was published, and Sasha Huber, who by chance had a financial fund to stay in Brazil, to do art residence, wrote me that she, with Hans Fassler, who is here, and I have the pleasure to meet today, was working on Agassiz in a campaign, anti-racist campaign. And I had found at, I am talking too much? No. Okay. At Peabody Museum, the huge collection of racist photographs that Agassiz commented by photographers in Rio de Janeiro and Manaus. I was the first person to find them. And with Sasha and with collaboration of Hans Fassler, with John Monteiro, and with Flávio Gomes, we wrote a little book with 40 images and did the exhibition in 2009 biennial, and then a separate exhibition somewhere from USP. And then, we start to plan to do a big exhibition who was not made because people at Harvard University has a big deal with this collection. It's extremely expensive. It's already being in juridical claim by, The
family has...
No, not the family. One of the descendants of rent slave was, I forgot her name. Do you remember her name? Hans? The name of the lady? No. The descendant of Rent, the woman in the West who is open up this claim. Yeah, I can remember. Doesn't matter. So things are in this way right now. But the good thing that came out of this second book, Traces of Louis Agassiz, that the collection, this is small 40 images, because the collection whole maybe has more than 200 images, was divulgated, and today many artists in Brazil, important ones, are working on it. So it's a good job, I think. Thank you.
You want to, Izabel, you continue.
Is it camera, linear?
Yeah.
Tamil is the name of the descendant. Thank you so much, and thank you as well, Maria Helena, for giving this, this example that things were made as well. Things were happening, maybe when nobody was seeing, but things were happening. And I'm very happy that you come back here not to talk only about Louis Agassiz, but as well other thematics, and as well to bring your experience on slavery, motherhood, and gender in different works we are realizing here now. But one of the questions we had for you all, it's a little bit like why, especially for Marianne and Beatrice, like why Brazil, why slavery? How did you get there? What is your personal experiences with that, and as well for you too, because you're both scholars, specialists of slavery. But how did you get to university? Why history? Which ways did you do to get there? As well for the students who are here as well. This question is super relevant. Thank you. Do we?
You choose. Should I start?
Please, yes.
Okay. When I passed my school leaving exams in 70, some years before, perspectives on non-European worlds had begun to spread in Switzerland. In 68, my history teacher made an experimented with group work about Far Eastern history as Japanese development until fascism, or Vietnam War, or Chinese Revolution. And in 70 or around 70, small solidarity groups for Chile, Nicaragua, and other countries emerged in civil society and joined a broader leftist movement. And at the university where I started in 70, Professor Rudolf von Albertini just had begun to research about imperialism and colonial history, especially the British Empire. So one of his young researchers, Hans-Werner Tobler, returned from Mexico. He had research about revolution of Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, and he became professor at the ETHZ and taught subjects as, for example, the dependencia theory, and I attended it. Then I wanted to write a research about Argentina, the relocation of industries, Swiss industries in Argentina. And I was sent by Tobler to look for materials in the National Archives. There was none, but there were 5 boxes, big boxes, of an immigration to Brazil. So I landed there. And it was especially happy evolution because the AHILA, the European Society for Latin American Studies, prepared a conference about migration from Europe to the Latin American countries and asked their country representatives to prepare reports about archives and the state of research. So I was involved in this, and then I was landed. That was the reason why I wrote about migration, Swiss migration to Brazil.
Well, I didn't start out as a historian, let alone of Brazil. When I was in college, I was a Spanish language and literature major. Like many women at the time, Beatrice, talvez you also, it was a time when women were not really expected to get PhDs. I was in the first class of women at a Jesuit college in Worcester, Massachusetts, called the College of the Holy Cross, which in its founding, it had never had women students since its founding in 1840-something. When I graduated, I became a high school Spanish teacher, and then left that and moved to Boston and took a job in the administration at Tufts University. One day I was in the bookstore, and I walked by this shelf of fabulous books about the Cuban Revolution in Nicaragua and Brazil and Argentina and Chile. And it was the reading for a course on Latin American revolutions taught by Professor Peter Wynne, one of the founders of Latin American labor history. 2 years later, I had finished a master's thesis on oral history on women in the Sandinista underground, somehow wound up at Yale, where I got a fellowship that in order to get paid, I had to learn Portuguese. I had to take Portuguese classes. And my advisor was Emília Viotti da Costa, the very eminent historian of Brazil and slavery. At the same time, it was almost impossible to plan a a dissertation program involving Central America. I mean, the situation in the mid-'80s was much too fraught. When I was finishing my master's thesis, the Contra were right up the road. Wounded people were being brought in. It just wasn't safe. And so I was searching for a topic, and again walked into the Yale bookstore, and here was Cacao by Jorge Amado. And I read it, and I thought, oh my God, it's my thesis.
That's my place.
And I guess that's the story. You know, so I didn't intend this. I didn't know that the job that I have existed when I was an undergrad. Had no idea. Who do I give this to next?
Yeah. So I came from an intellectual family. My father was PhD in Brazilian literature. He was a journalist, so it was natural to be to university and to study. Although I was very much against hierarchy, and I was rebellious. I still kind of in old age. But I didn't know what to study. From my house, all of the talks was about politics. My father was a leftist, a communist. We suffered in the 64 revolution, dictatorship, and etc. But I find myself in the university, so I have to do something. I don't know what. And by chance, I stumbled, I met a documentation, criminal records, and reading from 19th century. Reading then, I identify myself with the slaves, clearly. Because my question at the beginning of my career was oppression, and nothing is more oppressive than slavery. And I do, at this time already, I want to talk their lives. Nothing else. I am kind of gossiping, you know. And I wrote my first book, what was published in '87. And it's okay, it's still alive. And then I pursued this history, social history, telling stories more than anything. Of course, all of this is deeply connected with global history, of course. But my point of view is very local, always. And then later on, I start with travel literature, and then to diaries, and then to gender, and talk about women in slavery. Just catch me forever, because nothing can be more difficult than be a woman in slavery. So I finally, after many decades of research, I wrote a book with a co-author that I really like, which is Geminiani e seus filhos, which I finally wrote what I was supposed to write. That's it.
So in my case, I belong to a different generation because I was born in 1972, and I came to undergraduate studies at late 80s, early 90s. And that moment, especially 1989, was a moment of high politicization in Brazil because of the 1989 elections. And in Brazil, it's almost impossible to find someone who chooses to do history without being a leftist. So it's about more or less, because, you know, the profession, I don't know if you're going to agree with me, but the whole career structure and all that, usually you have this strong connection. So it's not a rule, okay, but let's say 80%. So you have more or less leftist feelings. And due to the huge inequalities in Brazil, so it's almost impossible studying Brazilian history not being someone from this side of the world. Anyway, and I choose the profession because of my political convictions. So I was really engaged in 1998, 89 elections, because it was two elections. There was one in 1988 and then 1989. And so once I got into undergraduate, started doing my readings, all that, and one really important experience that I had in my first 2 years is one of these collective readings of Capital of Marx with some colleagues, and after that they joined Workers' Party as a group of G. Marx, that's the name, and through the analysis of labor process and all that, I start, let's say, figuring out my interest on slavery studies. And you know, it's impossible to understand the very formation of capitalism in Brazil without having a stance on trajectory of slavery. And especially we have a huge intellectual tradition that dealt with that. And it's also interesting because, so this completely retrospective reconstruction. So when I was passing through that, I have no clue of what I was choosing. But afterwards, you can more or less, let's say, recover what were your choices, what you left aside, what you really choose in doing, and so on and so forth. But what I would say is that once I got into slavery studies, the real thing that really interested me was to understand how it's possible to Brazil to have this huge social inequality with this ingrained tradition of resistance, of popular resistance, with patterns of violence that are almost inconceivable elsewhere. And on the other hand, we have, let's say, a political trajectory that's really We have constant political turmoils in Brazilian history. And why these social inequalities, this, let's say, these traditions of resistance from the bottom up, why do all of that don't cross with the political turmoils? So if you pay attention to Brazilian history, it's maybe only the abolitionist movement is a moment when you have this crossing of inequalities, social inequalities, and then political turmoil. And for me, this is the biggest question to do slavery studies since then. You know, I always searching for the very same question: how to understand this stability in Brazilian history. And it's let's say, another way to put this question about slavery in Brazil, and to understand why we never had any possibility of having a sort of Haitian revolution in Brazil. And that's why I try to, let's say, put on the others the question on the other side. And for me, the strategy that I'm searching for in this, let's say, 30 years trajectory of doing slavery history is to do that by comparative studies, you know, so a long-term perspective. So this one way of doing that, not the only way of doing that, but that's how I'm trying to let's say, to face this historical question.
Thanks a lot. Before we move on, I mean, this is already extremely rich. I was wondering, do you have any follow-up questions among yourselves, stuff that you would like to comment on before we move on? Not at the moment, okay, because then, yeah, let's move on then to, I mean, you've already started talking about this a little bit. I mean, all of you, of course, have this extremely impressive kind of research output, and you mentioned, I mean, you started publishing in the 80s, so really a long trajectory. Some of you have, at least. No, but it's absolutely, it's fantastic because, I mean, you were, yeah. But one of the, I mean, so one of the things that I find interesting, you already talked about this a little bit, but maybe if you could be just a little bit more also explicit about it. I was wondering, how does this, not only your individual research, but of course you were part of kind of generations and kind of trends in historiography. So I'm just curious to learn more, I mean, from my perspective here in Europe, if you could talk, you, Helena, and also you, Rafael, a little bit more. You mentioned it a little bit. So what is the relationship, not only between you individually, but about between your profession, historians? What is the function, the role of historians in Brazilian kind of politics and history in the last, few decades? I mean, from the little that I know, and I think, of course, we have seen a lot of very, very important, you know, changes in social movements. I mean, of course, the emancipation of the formerly enslaved people fighting for social justice, for their rights, I think also for, et cetera and so forth. So if you could talk a little bit about that. Also then, what is the relationship between history in Brazil and then, the government, the changing governments, I mean, after the dictatorship. And then to you, Marianne, I would be curious to know more about, I mean, the very superficial understanding that I have about developments in the United States. I mean, of course, a hugely important movement that we see is, of course, the civil rights movements, right? And of course, then also when until this very day, actually, I mean, it's because the history of slavery is extremely important and also contested nowadays extremely. So if you could situate your choice, your career choice within that US conversation. I mean, how does your research then fit in a conversation which, I mean, as far as we understand it might be superficial, which is kind of really interested in, you know, the southern United States, slavery within the US, and you have kind of this kind of, you look a little bit beyond, right? And then, of course, also to you, Béatrice. I mean, we've talked oftentimes about this. I think it's fair to say that your book and your research, I mean, it's, I mean, we often don't really like using the term, but it's pioneering in many ways because, I mean, it's just like, you know, almost nothing there. So if you could talk, also reflect a little bit about how your research was then kind of also situated in the university context and within the kind of relevant social movements. I see, in the US and Brazil, of course, you have this very important movements of formerly enslaved people and civil rights movements. You already mentioned it a little bit. I think the women's liberation movement is also kind of important coming in, and of course also workers' social inequality. I think here in our side of the Atlantic, it is mostly, you mentioned 68, so we had a lot of kind of this critique of social inequalities and universities opening up also to welcoming new students who came from more modest backgrounds, etc. and so forth. Of course, the women's movement, but of course I don't think, it's difficult, but we didn't, maybe our kind of, it's only in the BLM summer that kind of something like anti-racial movement in Switzerland became, it was there before, but very weak, and so maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Who wants to start? Maria Elena, can you kind of reflect a little bit on that for us? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, when I start, I was very young, not 12, but almost 12, and was 1988, 100 years of abolition of slavery. I just had published my first book, and I was very green and shy, and there's lots of Congress, and I had to be in my first table with Emília Viotti da Costa and Cátia Matoso.
Oh, no.
And they said, filhinha, be calm, be calm. So it was a huge...
In case you don't know.
Yeah.
In case you don't know, two of the scariest people you've ever met.
Exactly. Both of them were women of power. And but from them, all the research were white. Some are women, mostly men, white. Through the time, at same time, in 88, Black movement, Black researchers start to be important. And then for today, we are dialoguing, and sometimes it's quite, today, it's not so easy to be a white researcher on slavery. I think with my approach, which was narrative, which was about rebuilding lives, and I have to be very careful. I was talking, for example, with Sasha Turner in one congress in London. She does a wonderful work. And she's a Caribbean research in US, professor in US. And she challenged me, how can you write? That's a question. And for example, in Geminiana, the last book, we rebuilt a history of the family in 3 generations. And it's very narrative. It's wrote as a novel, but has a huge research. But we never talk in the first person because we have to have this distance. And this distance is our respect to the things that we don't know as historians. We don't know everything. I think through the last I am very happy to be in the generation of historians who in some way renovated Brazilian historiography of slavery with their rights and wrongs. And I feel that this kind of work that humanizes slaves start to offer a new vocabulary to the social movement. We are not in the social movement as white historians, but we can collaborate, building, recognizing social relations by giving an X-ray of, how the system worked. And I recognize some vocabulary that, as historians, not myself, but my generation, built up, as some important tool to the social movement. And today in Brazil, the Black women's movement is strategic, is very, very important. And this raised the awareness of women in slavery, the double slavery, the parto sector ventring, the importance of slave over women's body as the tool of slavery. So I think we can collaborate, but of course it's not our duty to show up how structured racism work, because I don't know it. Right? I have to know my place. And of course, we are doing PhDs, students, we are, doing lots of work preparing a new generation of more grounded students. I think that's very important.
Yeah. So Maria Helena brings up a whole series, I think, of important issues. There's no question that in the United States, first of all, I need to say that Brazilian history and Latin American history in the United States are not separate, right? If you train, there's almost no graduate program that you could go to and study just about Brazil, right? And very few jobs would allow you to work only on Brazil. So one has to know a lot about Spanish America and Portuguese America as well, and sometimes, and this is more true perhaps in literature departments than in history departments, the assumption is that the two different languages make for very different cultures. And one of the things that I think has been coming out of the historiography about not only slavery, but slavery and freedom is the ways in which in the Americas, we are all the products of a very similar history, just the degrees are different, almost like syncopated jazz, right? In that it depends on the current historical situation, depends on the indigenous people who lived in the region, the geography of the region, the Europeans who colonized, the extent to which they brought Africans in as laborers, right? And so from Canada to Argentina, we have different histories, but there are some commonalities, I guess, number one. I would also say that for many Americans coming to the study of Brazil explicitly, when I started, the question was, why was it possible to abolish slavery in Brazil without a civil war? That was right. Why are Brazil and the United States so different in terms of their racial ideologies, et cetera? The civil rights movement meant that there were lots and lots of African-American, well, maybe not lots and lots, but many African-American graduate students in graduate school with me, which was a learning experience, certainly for me. We had, I think, well, in the history department at Yale in that time, there were 2 tenured women. Three, yeah. My dissertation advisor had to sue the university for tenure. So it was not an easy place to be a woman. Many of us were interested in women's topics and gender topics. That's not what I chose to do. And I didn't go to Brazil planning to work on the history of slavery and cacao because everybody knew there was none. It kind of found me because in the archives there were all of these stories and wonderful documents, but also post-mortem estate probate records, for those of you more familiar with the English terminology. And it just, as I started to talk about it, and in the same time period that you were doing this, people started telling me that I was crazy. I didn't know what I was talking about. Literally, the first time that WESCI, the State University of Santa Cruz, it was either the first or second historical symposium they had. I was there to do a 15-minute paper on the existence of slavery in cacao. There were like 100 people in the audience, and I was told in advance that the chair of the sociology program was going to humiliate me in public because everybody knew it wasn't true. And he came walking up to me in the end, and a television camera got shoved in my face. So that's something of a digression, but I think I agree with Maria Helena that as white historians, and particularly for me as a non-Brazilian, I have to be careful about how I treat people, about what I do, etc. But I also think that because of the privilege that I had as a foreigner and as a woman, no one took me seriously. And so I got access to things that I know that someone who was a researcher for the public archive in Bahia had been told to ignore, that really he didn't want to go there because it was dangerous. And yet I was able to access it because they knew I was going away. They didn't think it would be a big, and by they, I mean officials in the Archbishop's office, in the courthouse, in various other places, just didn't think I would find anything. And it still is only started out to be a small part of what I was doing, and as various people have shown, including Izabel, there is an enormous amount of material outside of Brazil's major cities and major archives to be found. It just takes a little bit more effort, and sometimes it helps to be a foreigner because you have no local connections. And I didn't have to worry about getting a job in Brazil. No, I didn't, because people who were trying to do what I had done had been threatened with unemployment, essentially, if they published everything. We're afraid that they would lose their jobs if they had published everything they knew. And I think we have to remember that in the 1980s, Southern Bahia was the second largest producer of cacao in the world. And cacao planters walked around with guns. And they didn't have a problem using them. Okay? Lula came to campaign in 1988 or 89, and I was in the Vesuvius bar with a friend after the comício, after the speech, right? And we overheard planters saying, "Those guys put 1 foot on my property, I'm going to shoot them." Wow. This is in downtown Ilhéus in 1989. Okay? So to be a Brazilian planning to work in that set of institutions and come up with unpleasant information was potentially quite dangerous. Now, whether they were serious or not, I have no idea. Lots of people say a lot of things when they've had too much to drink. But
May I just have Thanks a lot. Just a quick follow-up. I mean, yeah, I find it impressive being the outsider can be an advantage sometimes in this context. But related to that, I think, how do you then manage? I mean, usually we as historians, we have our audience, and oftentimes, I have, my imaginary audience is people here. I write for them. I mean, even if it's not kind of subconsciously. So in your case, I'd be curious, how did you? Yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that. Do you speak to your fellow Americans, or both, or how do you kind of navigate that?
I have no idea because I think I am still talking to the people who said you're crazy. Okay. Okay. No, seriously. I mean, it was a big deal. The most important article that I have ever published, will ever publish, was I think a 20-page article in Afroasia that just documented the existence of enslaved people and cacao growing in Bahia, the place where slavery started in Brazil. And it came out in Portuguese in 2001, 2002, and the people who had explored this before had been sociologists for the most part. Yeah. Or it was also a time, I think, in not only slavery studies, but in the study of political economy, where everyone wanted to know what the premier mode of production was. Was that the most important mode of production? I don't know, right? And I also have a real problem with those people who think it matters how many individuals you own, right? Like you have to own 200 people for it to be, so if you only own one, that's okay. And I don't subscribe to that set of notions, right? And it was a time in the historiography of Brazil where the assumption was that plantation slavery in places like the Recôncavo of Bahia, the sugar plantations of Bahia, or the coffee region of Sao Paulo were the paradigm, and that everything else was just sort of poor people and runaways, and you didn't have sort of small farmers, the kinds of people that Bert Barackman talks about. And if you haven't read his work on Bahia, particularly the Portuguese version, that talks about the production of manioc, enslaved people working on manioc in Bahia, and this kind of counterpoint, as he puts it, between the production of manioc and the production of sugar. It's really important because it opens up the way that we talk about export economies in a really significant way. Yeah. But I should also say that family history and Linda Lewin's work was really influential for me. And one of the things that I had to do, some of which I'm going to present tomorrow, I had to create genealogies of a group of these people because I couldn't keep them straight. And once you start to recognize that all these guys had wives and mothers, yeah, and that many of them are related. They just don't use the mother's surname so much. Then it becomes possible to see connections between and among people that, among families who own property and people as well, right? And it also enabled me to start creating genealogies of a few people whose lives bridge slavery and freedom. Yeah. So, yeah.
Very interesting question, and I will try to make, let's say, a long history short. Okay, but listening to Marianne and Maria Helena, I was remembering a wonderful phrase, more or less like that, by Simon Schama, historian on Dutch Empire and all that, and I think it's in the Embarrassments of Richness, that book on 17th century Dutch culture. And he says more or less like that, historians love the tiresome game of generation conflict. My professor's orthodoxy will be my heresy. So it's more or less like that. We have this historiographical pendulum in the Brazilian historiography all along the 20th century that reaches up to the nowadays. So that's the long history that I want to make it short. We have, let's say, great historians, sociologists that dealt with slavery in Brazil, starting with Joaquim Nabuco. Okay. So this his book on abolitionism is a great book on the history of slavery, one of the best books in 19th century history of slavery, side by side with José Antonio Sacco of Cuba, of Vallon in France, so on and so forth. Then we have, let's say, a rereading of Nabucco by Gilberto Freire. And Gilberto Freire was recovering not Nabucco from the abolitionism, but from the book from my formation, Minha Formação. And then we have all this myth of racial democracy based on Freire that was really powerful and was crucial to building national identity in Brazil in the 1930s, 40s, and so on and so forth. Then we have another generation, the generation of Florestan Fernandes, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Emília Viotti da Costa, all those guys who were really innovative in the sociological level, let's say, building a bridge between functionalism, US functionalism, and Marxism, on the other hand, by the sociologists, and on the other hand, by the historians, a really innovative crossing of the analysis school and Marxism. So Brazil was really pioneer in this. Emília Viotti is one of these cases. Fernando Novaes, other case. And this generation was really innovative as well in their reading of the relationships between capitalism and slavery. So outside the Caribbean was the first spot in the world that was reading closely Eric Williams' work and saying new things about how you relate capitalism and slavery and all that. Then we have the mode of production generation with 155 modes of production. But on the other hand, was really productive. If you take, for instance, Ciro Flammarion Santana Cardoso, I think he's the most well-known Brazilian historian in Latin America. Everybody knows him in Latin America. So Central America is absolutely crucial for, let's say, agrarian history studies, all that. But he was dialoguing with this tradition of mode of production, but again, as a reading of the second generation of the analysis school, Labrousse, all that, with Marxism. Then comes the generation that Maria Helena was talking about, the 80s and the 90s with social history. And when we see all these movements of innovations vis-a-vis the previous generation, it's more or less like a spiral movement. So it seems that we are coming back to the very same spot, but no, we are always moving forward. So that's the long history. I want to make it short. How I see myself, the things that I'm doing, I'm trying to recover some of these traditions of discussing capitalism and slavery and all that, without, let's say, denegating the whole past, but trying, let's say, to build something on this very movement of the hermeneutic circle, paying attention to what has come in the past, but then moving forward, making this dialogue with this older generations. And then this is something I would like to comment on the traditions of US. So, let's say, we have nowadays in US this new history of capitalism and slavery, or new history of capitalism, which basically, since in US you have, let's say, I don't know if you are going to agree with me, but we have another way of framing the careers. So when you join the academic career, you have to bring something new. And you have to, let's say, present yourself in the academic milieu being innovative, bringing some breakthrough and all that, because otherwise you are not going to get any job. Am I right? More or less.
More or less.
Okay.
Sometimes even if you are innovative, you won't get a job.
Okay. Good point. So But because of this structure, you have to present arguments as as if it was new arguments, okay? And eventually, you have new, let's say, an old wine in a new bottle, okay? That's what's happened with the new history of capitalism and slavery. So there's simply recovering the 70s with climatricians, and why does it happen? Because you have to present yourself, let's say, denegating completely the past, you know? And this is a position that I see myself and other colleagues as well in Brazil, is that because of the Brazilian career structure with concurso público, so when we are going to join the university, we don't have to ask for recommendation letters. This something doesn't exist in Brazil. You have to go through exam, and you have to present yourself in exam, and let's say more or less like the exams you have in the French old tradition of, and then you can, let's say, eventually, you are not forced to denegate the past, doing what you're doing in the present. And I think one of really good things that I'm talking about, let's say, how I see the whole frame of the career. I think that's a really good, let's say, platform. This is a really good platform in order to establish these dialogues with the historiographical traditions, you know, and they are really powerful in the sense that they have something to tell about the ways that we do history nowadays. For sure, it's not simply, let's say, writing the same history that they wrote in the past, but operating this movement of permanent, let's say, cycle of the spiral. I think that's a good way of let's say, produce new stuff and all that. And also, I think it's a good way to, let's say, to establish new dialogues, let's say, with the very topic of this conference. I know that's, again, it's a view, not the view of how the field works, but I think it's an important counterpoint to pay attention to.
Just one question. Is there a way to increase oxygen in this room?
We can open the door, maybe. Maybe, yeah, Denise can open the door for us. Because unfortunately we cannot open windows, can we? Yeah. Take a deep breath. Okay, we're. Izabel, I think we need you back here on the podium. We're getting there, Reis. We're getting there. We're going to open up in a minute, and if you want to stand up, maybe you want to all stand up and exercise a bit, get blood circulation running. But we're getting there. We're getting there. Thanks for hanging with us. So, it's extremely interesting. So, yeah. Beatrice, to you then also the same question. I mean, I think what is really fascinating to see that in these different kind of systems and regions in Brazil and the US and of course in Europe, we see, I mean, what you kind of, your experience and what you were part of is kind of really this extremely important development in all historiographies, kind of trying to break up this old tradition of history that was really very strongly focused on political history, diplomatic history, etc. and so forth. And I mean, you know, to kind of convince people, it's a struggle to convince people, look, other histories matter, right? Histories of women, history of everyday life, histories of formerly enslaved people, etc. And that it's a struggle, obviously. So, Beatrice, I think you were also part. I mean, you were mentioned at the beginning also. I mean, back in a European or Swiss context, we had this. We refer to the '68 movement because the summer of '68 here in Europe or in this part of Europe was extremely important. That opened up a lot in society, culturally, and I think then had a certain impact in university, but it didn't. It didn't just happen from one day to the next. There's also a lot of resistance. So if you can talk a little bit about that, Beatrice. I mean, you came, I think, from this opening that was kind of, people struggled for it, fought for it on the streets, and then kind of tried to push it into the university. But your kind of position then within this opening and struggles was rather unique, you told me.
Yeah. Yes, I have quite another story. When I began my studies, the main interest of the history students was the history of labor movement. This was a very strong interest, and the main part of the history students were leftists at that time. Mostly the Department of History was left. And so
Students were left.
Students and assistants too, but not the professors. And when I communicated that I was interested in the history of this immigration and the overseas history, as one could say that, they looked at me, and my fellow students looked at me and thought I'm crazy. And I'm stupid, and I'm not a leftist, and so on. It was quite difficult because I was really isolated with my interests, and I hardly understood why this wasn't of interest for the students, the leftist students. So there was no discussion. I was really very alone, I must say, and this stayed like that because afterwards, with some years, this leftist movement closed and was really, I hardly dare to say oppressed, because it's quite some difference to a Brazilian situation, that's clear, but the result was that the history closed again to Swiss topics and not looking at mechanisms of capitalism or something like this. This was absolutely no subject anymore. And just with later decades, some of the students began, but I think they were very alone too. There was no movement anymore. So I had to change my subject because there was no institution which would care for Latin American history. Absolutely none. And my advisor, the Tobler, told me I should change, otherwise I would have no chance at the university. So I chose gender history. That wasn't easy either, because this was a minority subject too. And there was a colleague of mine, a dear friend, which was a little bit older and earlier, and she gained a professorship in Basel for gender history, and then it was closed. That's enough for gender history in Switzerland. So it's very difficult. These alternative views in Switzerland were really very, very difficult. And I think this job that you mainly do with others is something very special, and it's very debated, I think. It's a threat for many Swiss politicians. And so it's something important. We will see. what it leads to.
I think I would repeat the same question that Bernhard did to Marianne. I mean, to who were you writing, though? Like, I mean, for me, I always had the egoistic impression you were writing for me. Because I was, when I read you the first, and as well Beatrice Virassá, your both books, I was like, oh, it's the perfect book for a Swiss Brazilian historian. I really found myself in your, but to who were you writing then by this time? I wasn't there.
I stopped writing about Brazilian history, so it wasn't possible to maintain this activity because there was no funds, no possibilities of jobs and so on, so I stopped. But then I started with the gender history, and there you have even in Switzerland, you have this movement, and you have a certain amount of people, women mainly, who are interested in and work in gender history, and for these I write. There is an association now for gender studies in Switzerland, and this is quite a group, so this is a better situation, but for Latin American history, it's really difficult.
We have something called intersectionality now that cross both, so it's possible.
So I think I also want to add to that question about for whom do we write. I'm at an institution that doesn't train PhDs. We have master's degrees. We primarily train public school teachers. And we have two master's degrees. One is a traditional MA, master's in history. The other is in public history. And it's a very heavy teaching load. Right, in that way, it's more like Wesky than it was years ago. And I think that all of us, in addition to writing, also teach a lot. And I have come to the conclusion that teaching Latin American history, teaching a new view of slavery studies, teaching students how to research, who are then going to go on to become public school teachers, many of whom are African American or Latine, right, and are going to be working in predominantly Black and Latin American school systems is much more important than training PhD students who will have a difficult time getting a job because of the collapse of the market for professors of history in the United States. It started in 2008, but it has accelerated. It's coming back, I think, a little bit now, and I don't pay a lot of attention to the PhD level job market, but it has been very, very difficult in all fields. My department is 30% smaller than it was, maybe 40% smaller than it was 20 years ago. And there is no sign that that will change. So.
It's interesting because what we have in Brazilian university system is more or less like that. What we train are school teachers, mostly. So, and a lot of school teachers are going to do their PhDs, and they are going to keep being school teachers. So, and then we have a really broad audience. It's amazing because then we can reach, let's say, with all the mediations for sure, but you can reach small communities through our work in the university. So I think in Brazil at least, and as you're saying, also in some spots in U.S. University system, it's really powerful because then you can have, let's say, a much broader audience that what you write and so on and so forth.
I think One of the frontiers from historians is now to write something that the public in general can read, because research in history is too strategic. Of course, that the formation of middle-level teachers and pedagogy and so on is very important. But the research on history is still very strategic. It's something that we can give up. And then I foresee that the frontier is learning how to write to the public in a way that people can read us and not be bored. You know, I'm writing my PhD, so I have to read this enormous book about who has lots of digressions about many subjects. We have to learn how to write. Write is fundamental for historians. I learned that with my advisor because she was a wonderful writer. So learn how to write. And that makes history, understandable, sensible, something that can tell everybody a little piece of the past and respond some issues that each generation brought up. So we have a mission, not a very important mission. Intellectuals are, out of fashion completely in the world. And universities are being, in the backlash of all modernization and artificial intelligence and so on. But we still have a small tasks to fulfill. That's it.
Just to not finish with these depressive words. For the PhDs, we're going to get unemployed, like we have a mission, but we don't get anything back. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, there's still a task. Nothing comes back, but there is a task to do. Okay, we are used to. Yes, exactly. That's what I wanted to do, to finish in a more positive way. We would like to open to you. I just please ask you to talk on the microphone, so then Vanessa can translate. So who? Exactly, English or Portuguese. But then I think I will translate to English, because, yeah, but no worry, Vanessa, I translate, or someone else, because then the others don't have the same, whatever. Aline?
Let me look at the questions. English, Portuguese. Well, for you it's French, no.
English. So when I studied history in Brazil, but with the gang of Rio de Janeiro. And anyway, and I left Brazil. I started the university when we had the law to teach African diasporic history. And I would like to ask you, what is your experience that this law has passed 10 years ago? What is your experience in new epistemologies, new methodologies, new research objects, new professionals that are being formed, trained as professors, researchers, etc.? Thank you.
Who were you directing the question to? Helena and Rafael, or
everybody?
Good.
Thank you.
Just checking. Who? Someone?
No.
This was a huge transformation, not only. So I teach American colonial history, so basically Spanish, American, French Caribbean, British Caribbean, and so on. But as I follow everything that's happening, this was a huge transformation that happened in Brazilian scholarship. And so nowadays we have, let's say, we can say that we have a Brazilian school of Africanists, and with a huge impact in public discourse, in political debates, and also in schools, elementary school, high school and elementary school. So this is one of, let's say, one of the laws that comes from bottom up and top down, and so let's say a dialectical movement with a huge transformation, but not only African history, but also indigenous history. And so it's a evolving movement that's happening everywhere in Brazil with different, let's say, trends, but it's a movement that is still going on, and I think to make let's say, a more solid evaluation of the outcomes of this transformation, we still have to wait for a little bit to have an overall view. But I'm sure it's completely positive history, a transformative history.
Well, the 5.963 law, of course, was very important and opened up a field of African history, because in Brazil, surprisingly, 15 years ago, the law has more than 10 years, we didn't have African history, Once I was in a Congress in the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco in Recife, and the ambassador was giving a conference about Joaquim Nabuco and Africa. And he said, this is the shortest conference I will give in my life, because Joaquim Nabuco never said a word about Africa. So traditional history in Brazil completely invisibilized African history. So it was a, emerging field, and people still have to learn how to deal with, because it's not a question of go to the class and say Africa was there or there, but the way they related to the students, how they read pedagogical manuals. You see there, they're still using Debré with all these images of debased slaves being punished, all negative. And that's why I think history, the research must goes on, because you have to change the parameters of how to write. Otherwise, how can you transmit what is not done? And I think one of the major changes was affirmative action in Brazil. That's changed everything, Affirmative action in Brazil works extremely well. Everybody was against it. In my university, our university, people are completely against. Few people were for affirmative action, but it works, and it is changing the profile of the students, the undergrad and the graduate, and then you can really change and fulfill the essence of the law, because you have to have the material. You have to have the way people the teacher put himself, herself inside the class, because there is lots of racism implicit. And with the hair, with the way people talk, their personal and familiar history. It's important to talk about Africa, but I think it's more important to change the way people, teachers, work, which is very complicated in Brazil still. With Bolsonaro government, all the ghosts emerged and people are very, very racist. So what to do with them?
I'm not Brazilian, obviously, but there are two things that I wanted to say. One is I had the good fortune once to spend some time with Benedita da Silva, the first Black woman senator in Brazil. She's gone on to have a magnificent political career. I was at the University of Notre Dame at the time, and she came for a conference, and she was pushing very hard for a textbook in Afro-Brazilian history. And so I think that to get back to some of our earlier questions, the presence of people of African descent who claim that descent in the legislature, in positions of authority, have been very important in Brazil. And in the sense of encouraging people to claim their ancestry, I gave a history methods class the semester that I taught at FESP, and there was a completely mixed race group in front of me, and only one person out of 35 claimed their African ancestry. The rest of them, who clearly had indigenous or African ancestry, all told me about their German, Italian, French, English, Portuguese genealogy. And I was looking at them going, there's a big elephant in the room here. So that's one thing that I think, right, and that this movement, the creation of textbooks, a good friend of mine was, or several of us actually, Walter Fraga was, right, involved in. But also, I think the collaboration between Brazilian scholars, scholars in the United States, Caribbeanists, Canadians, and also Africans in the broader creation of an African diaspora history. I'm thinking about Paul Lovejoy, João Reis, Joe Miller, with whom I had the opportunity to spend a summer as part of one of the summer institutes that he gave. And he was a historian of Africa who also worked in the diaspora. And many of us had been studying Latin American history for a long time and had no sense of the history of Africa as anything other than a cipher that, because what we were told is you can't know anything. There's nothing to be, there are no documents, nobody knows anything, and nothing could be further from the truth. So I think that collaboration of the history of the Atlantic world among historians of people of African descent from Africa, Europe, Canada, the Caribbean, and Spanish and Portuguese America has been very, very important.
Can I just compliment? Oh, sorry. No.
You want to add something?
I would like to say something about Switzerland in this case. because one of my colleagues in the early days of the student days studied African history, and he was planned as my advisor to have a professorship later on, but this didn't ever happen. So it's the same thing with African history in Switzerland as it is for Latin American history. I think Switzerland has very much difficulties to accept that it is a very diverse society today. It is extremely racist, and it is negating that it's racist. So these topics do not or hardly do emerge. That's very difficult. It's a very different situation to the States or even Brazil, that's clear. I think it's a very difficult society to open up for actual questions and problems, and yeah.
Thanks. Are there any oh, okay, yeah. I'm coming with the microphone. So that's the one question here. Are there other questions then? Let me just collect. Here. Oh.
Good evening. Evening, right? Yeah. Jet lagged. I'll get there. Thank you to the organizers and also to the panelists. My question, I hope, is not too multi-part. Because of the nature of this conference, hi, so my name is Yuko Miki, Fordham University, is because of the international nature, right? This transatlantic Swiss-Brazilian connections kind of points to me for the larger issue of the kind of the internationalization of us, right? That kind of work requires us to speak multiple languages, to be able to travel, right? And of course, in the academy, not everybody has access to that, right? So I'm just wondering, like, how this kind of work that is important is also kind of shaped but also limited by a person's position, their ability to actually access these things. Like, I think it's wonderful. My dream is to be able to sponsor more Brazilian and I'm Japanese, so like Japanese scholars working in Mozambique, like, but they don't have the access to these kinds of spaces that I wish we could create more. But it's like, you know, there's an inequality there too, right? As a Brazilian scholar, you have to be able to speak English to be able to do your postdoc at Harvard and Columbia and Princeton. And at the same time, so there's that kind of challenge to internationalization in terms of, well, it's privilege, right? But also kind of language, which is also privilege. But the second part is also, of course, now we know that many of these countries, Europe and my own country, Japan, just, and of course the United States, this kind of much more inward lookingness, right? It's about the US first, Japan now is saying Japan first, like, and so there's a lot of kind of inward lookingness, which is kind of going against what we're talking about here about these kind of connections and international visions and movements. So I'm wondering for you guys, how you see, first of all, this kind of access to being able to do this international work, but where you see this kind of work that we're doing now in this context of this kind of increasingly kind of closing of borders in terms of knowledge production.
Yeah, are there any other questions? Well, you can still think. Maybe Marianne, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
So I think Yuko has a wonderful point. First of all, the fellowship that I had in graduate school that paid my tuition and gave me a small but existing stipend every semester of $4,000 or $5,000 at the time is on the chopping block at the Department of Education. It's been cut and it has been eradicated. I think, right, the Title VI, it is for language training of languages that are not commonly studied in the United States, and that's how I learned Portuguese. I was a Spanish major as an undergraduate. My master's thesis research is on the Sandinista Revolution. I did not know how to speak Portuguese. I was interested in Brazil, and it was only that fellowship that not only allowed me to quit my job, which I think it was a 75% income drop that I took to go to graduate school. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the current administration in the United States, much of the research that gets done around the world by undergraduates or by graduate students or PhDs is funded by the Fulbright Commission. Well, Brazil has just decided to pay for the Fulbright fellowships that the Trump administration eradicated. They cut the entire, they cut all of the fellowships for U.S. scholars to Brazil. They not only denied for this year, I'm told, anybody who was working on anything having to do with slavery or race or climate change. Yeah. And the Brazilian government has replaced the fellowships. There were 20 of them open. Now, many of us who studied the history or politics or anything of Brazil, or Brazilians who came to the United States, were only able to do that because of the Fulbright program. Right? And that is... Huh? Yeah. No, in both directions. And it has been eradicated. So, but, well, I have an application pending there right now, so we'll have to see.
One more optimistic note. First, Yuko. I am participating in the huge project in Japan with like 15 professors about slavery. So there is a movement there. I was there in 23, and there's lots of interest in Latin American slavery, incredibly. And then, with artificial intelligence, translation is being really getting easy, a revolution. Our students can just translate everything and make it very, very cheap, inclusive. So I feel that we are, having much more proximity, is easy to travel. Brazil is doing lots of scholarships to graduate students. My undergrad, with a FAPESP grant, undergrad, went to London to research on the public office. So I think we are, evolving, and artificial intelligence will take care of lots of our disconnection.
So I don't disagree, Maria Helena, but I guess I would say for Americans or US-based scholars and perhaps Swiss as well, when I began, there was an enormous disparity between what was possible for someone from the United States and what was possible for someone from Brazil. Yeah. And we had to recognize that and spend time there and develop trust. And because the resources, especially for a place like Bahia and the interior of Bahia, which even though Ilhéus is on the coast, it's in the interior. I think we, as scholars who came up in programs with many more resources, and I mean, let's face it, my dissertation advisor was one of the top scholars of Brazilian history who had left Brazil because of the military regime. And so, right, and so and she always insisted that we recognize that and we pay attention to the degree of privilege that we have in comparison to Brazil. Now, I think that that has leveled a significant amount over the course of the last 30 years, right? And there are many more fellowships for Brazilians, and there are many more universities, especially in the Northeast, where the people who are the descendants of the people that we talk about are now studying the history of the region that they come from, and I think that's incredibly important to recognize. Yeah, so some of them are here today.
And just to finish, we always have the weapons of the week, okay? In Brazil, if someone gets a password from Columbia, from Harvard, we share it to everyone. And then we have access to, that's incredible. I'm not joking, I'm joking and I'm not joking, you know? And then with few resources, you can do a lot of things. And IA makes the whole difference on having access to a lot of materials that is still being digitalized. So every time that you come back to Heritage Trust or let's say all this repertoires of sources, it's incredible. And what I see in Brazilian students is exactly this. Let's say they're facing the challenge of doing that with let's say open mind. And really facing the world. So I'm optimistic about that, Yuko, you know. And then all this inequalities, global inequalities, with technology, I think, not, let's say, being naive saying that, okay? But I think more or less you have the tendency of settling down the inequalities on how to do history, on the possibility of doing history in a broader perspectives. So it's an optimistic tone. Okay.
So this has been extremely rich. I think is the translator back, or is we had some? Okay, they're back. So there is a possibility for one more last question. If you have something that you want to really ask. If not, I think everybody will agree that we had a wonderful opening to this conference. So thank you all for your participation today and for sharing your wisdom and insight. I think it's been a great opening. So we're very much looking forward now for the next 2 days of really then in-depth case studies, cutting-edge research that is being done on both sides of the Atlantic for the next 2 days. Now for today, the way we will continue, so all of you who are, let me just kind of get a survey of the room. How many of you here came as visitors who play no, how to say, active role, not presenting any papers, not sharing, just okay, or are not kind of friends and spouses and have helped in any other way. So I think it's really, yeah. So I think, I mean, speaking of funding, I mean, yeah, we're happily funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. Our budget is limited, but I think we can afford additional guests who came here today. So I'd like to invite you all then to move outside. I think if I heard correctly, there is an aperitif, as we say here, being prepared. So let's continue our conversations in the aperitif. And yeah, hope to see all of you again here tomorrow, 9 o'clock sharp. Thank you very much.